At 0800 hours, at 75 degrees north off the coast of Greenland, the collision alarm on the USS Gerald R. Ford erupted across the carrier. In the Combat Information Center, the Aegis system suddenly pushed past its limits. Command screens went dark for a split second, then came back filled with red system warnings. Satellite contact was gone. Link 16 had dropped offline. Then the island's backup optical sensors caught something through the frozen fog. A massive heat signature only 40 kilometers out, closing fast across the surface of the Arctic Sea. A Russian Zircon hypersonic anti-ship missile was racing toward the carrier at sea level, moving at Mach 9. With radar guidance compromised, the Phalanx defensive cannons had no clean target lock. Time to contact, 14 seconds. In that moment, the $13 billion supercarrier was left almost defenseless, carrying 5,000 sailors in the middle of one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. This crisis unfolded during Operation Arctic Sentinel, a mission designed to break Russia's electronic blockade of the GIUK Gap and protect the Pituffik radar station in Greenland. But Washington had underestimated Moscow's plan. To shield its operation from prying eyes, Russia had transformed this stretch of international waters into a silent, nearly inescapable zone. So the question became urgent. Did the U.S. Navy still have a way to regain control, or was this the moment Western influence in the Arctic began to collapse? The chain of events had started 12 hours earlier, when Pentagon surveillance satellites detected Russia activating a massive electronic barrier built around the Murmansk BN system. According to military analysts, its real purpose was to conceal a large-scale strategic missile exercise taking place right on NATO's doorstep, placing direct pressure on the early warning network connected to the Pituffik station. Carrier Strike Group 12, led by the USS Gerald R. Ford was immediately ordered to move in and break through the blockade. U.S. destroyers switched their AN/SLQ-32 V7 systems into passive triangulation mode, quietly tracking Russian transmissions without revealing their own position. But the Northern Fleet had already prepared for that move. The moment the American carrier group entered the waters near Greenland, Russian aerospace forces activated the Peresvet ground-based laser system from the Kola Peninsula. A high-energy beam was aimed into orbit, interfering with US KH-11 optical reconnaissance satellites passing over the region. At the same time, the newest generation of Murmansk BN electronic warfare systems, secretly positioned on autonomous ice stations around the US fleet, began pushing powerful radio waves into the ionosphere. A geomagnetic storm made the situation even worse. The charged upper atmosphere turned into a giant reflective layer, bending American radar signals and throwing them back toward the ocean from thousands of false angles. Within seconds, the Aegis combat system was drowning in phantom data. On radar screens, U.S. officers watched 5,008 ghost targets appear from every direction, each one seemingly moving at Mach 10. GPS became unreliable. Communication channels filled with heavy white noise, and in the middle of the Arctic fog, the world's most advanced aircraft carrier was forced to face a threat it could barely see. Russia did not stop there. At the same time, it launched a coordinated cyber operation through floating hydrophone networks, slipping into the U.S. fleet's wireless logistics system and freezing the automated ammunition coordination network. Within the first minute of the encounter, the American fleet was cut off from the outside world, trapped inside a complex electronic web where every signal, sensor, and command channel was under pressure. The situation was hanging by a thread, but if you believe the U.S. Navy still had a chance to turn this around, write yes in the comments below. Refusing to remain passive, the American commander gave the order for an immediate launch under MCON Alpha 4. EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft were thrown into the dark Arctic sky at full power. Their mission was clear: locate the source of the interference and shut it down. The Growler crews activated their AN/ALQ-218 passive signal detection systems and spread out in a low-altitude formation, flying just 30 meters above the ocean. They used the curve of the Earth and the chaotic Arctic waves to hide their radar profile as they pushed deeper into the frozen darkness. Onboard computers began tracing the powerful signals being fired into the ionosphere. In less than 45 seconds, the passive sensors locked onto 3 major Murmansk BN signal stations. But they were not on the mainland. They were hidden on massive drifting icebergs about 80 nautical miles from the carrier group. The Growler squadron leader immediately cleared the launch sequence. 8AGM 88GA-ARGM-ER anti-radiation missiles left their rails, cutting through the Arctic night at Mach 2. Moments later, 3 bright bursts lit up the horizon. The Russian transmission arrays were taken offline, and the artificial reflection effect collapsed almost instantly. On the Aegis screens, thousands of phantom contacts disappeared at once. the tactical picture became clear again. Internal communications began coming back online. For the first time since the encounter began, the U.S. fleet had broken through the electronic wall and regained awareness of the battlefield. But the Americans had not realized one crucial thing. The moment their missiles fired was also the moment they triggered the Northern Fleet's second, far more dangerous trap. The heat trails from the American missile engines were picked up by the OLS-50 sensors of Su-57 Felon stealth fighters, which had been waiting high above the region at altitudes between 8,000 and 18,000 meters. The Russian pilots immediately launched R-37M long-range air-to-air missiles toward the E-2D Hawkeye operating behind the American formation. If the Hawkeye was forced out of action, the carrier group would lose its long-range air coordination advantage. That would leave the entire formation reacting almost blind to threats beyond the horizon. Because the Russian missiles relied on passive infrared guidance during the mid-course phase, the American radar warning receivers stayed silent. There was no early alert, no clear warning, and no obvious signal to track. Only in the final seconds, when the missile seekers switched on, did the danger fully appear. But the bigger problem was unfolding around the escort wing. To protect the Growlers, the U.S. had deployed F-35C fighters, supported by XQ-58 Valkyrie drones. Russia answered with IL-22PP Porubchik electronic warfare aircraft, sending out high-power microwave pulses aimed directly at the American data links. The energy surge overloaded the drone transceivers and severely disrupted the Valkyrie's processing algorithms. Then the identification system began to fail. The IFF network, designed to separate friendly aircraft from hostile ones, was manipulated and turned against the formation. Suddenly, the very F-35Cs leading the escort screen were marked as enemy targets. The drones locked onto the F-35Cs at the same time and began opening their weapons bays. In that critical moment, the F-35C pilots reacted instantly, cutting the compromised drones off from the command network before they could fire. Their quick decision kept the escort fighters safe, but the American defensive formation had already been thrown into disorder. Russia seized the opportunity. Su-57 fighters dropped from high altitude, moving in like predators from above as the American aircraft scattered across the Arctic sky. At the same time, the water around the U.S. fleet began to churn. Out of the heavy fog, dozens of unusual shapes sliced through the waves, racing toward the formation. The AN/SPS-73 surface radar aboard the escort ships tried to scan the area, but the returns were messy and unreliable, distorted by interference from drifting ice and broken sea clutter. These were Russian Morena M unmanned surface vessels. Unlike ordinary fast attack boats, the Morena M was built as a semi-submersible platform. Only a small communications antenna and tiny optical sensors, barely larger than a soda bottle, remained above the surface. Its composite hull was coated with radar-absorbing material, and as it moved between 4-meter Arctic waves, it became extremely difficult for electronic surveillance systems to track. The U.S. fleet answered with one of its most advanced defensive systems, mounted on a leading Arleigh Burke-class Flight II A destroyer, the 60-kilowatt Helios high-energy laser. On paper, the system was ideal for this kind of threat. A laser beam moving at the speed of light should have been able to disable the optical sensors of the approaching vessels with pinpoint accuracy. The rotating laser turret locked on and sent invisible streams of energy toward the incoming targets, which were closing in at nearly 50 knots. But Russia had timed the operation carefully. The thick, freezing fog, packed with suspended ice crystals and water particles, became a natural shield. As the laser energy passed through it, the Tyndall effect scattered the beam in every direction. By the time the energy reached the targets, most of its power had already been lost. America's next-generation defensive system was suddenly limited by the basic physics of the Arctic environment. Realizing the lasers were not enough, American crews switched to conventional close-range defense. The destroyers opened up with 127mm and 25mm cannons, firing at extremely short range as the unmanned vessels pushed through the fog. Most of the incoming craft were stopped before reaching the formation, but one Morena M slipped through the defensive fire and rushed toward the stern of an escort destroyer. It reached the waterline and detonated its charge directly beneath the vulnerable rear section of the ship. The blast did not take the 9,000-ton destroyer out of the fight, but the shockwave tore through the towed array cable and disabled the AN/SQR-20 multi-purpose sonar system. In an instant, the fleet lost one of its most important underwater detection tools. A dangerous gap opened beneath the surface, and that was exactly the signal the Northern Fleet had been waiting for. The loss of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer's MFTA towed array sonar became the green light for Russia's submarine force to move. The real threat was now rising from beneath the Arctic waters. The Yasen M-class nuclear-powered attack submarine K-571 Krasnoyarsk. Its objective was clear. It had to remove the final underwater shield protecting the U.S. carrier group. The Virginia-class Block 5 attack submarine USS Colorado, which had been silently escorting the USS Gerald R. Ford from below. Russia made the first move by releasing 4 MG-74M acoustic decoys. These devices separated from the submarine and began imitating the sound profile of real targets, including propeller movement and the heavy mechanical noise of torpedo tube doors opening. Inside the USS Colorado, passive sonar operators were suddenly faced with 4 separate contacts surrounding them, each one appearing ready to fire. There was no time for a perfect analysis. In that tense moment, the American captain had to make an immediate decision. Acting in self-defense, he ordered the launch of Mark 48 ADCAP torpedoes toward the suspected threats. But that response gave away exactly what Russia wanted. The launch created a clear acoustic signature, exposing the Colorado's real position in the water. Meanwhile, the Russian submarine remained hidden inside the sonar baffle zone, where detection was far more difficult. From that blind spot, it quietly released a UET-1 ichthyosaur electric torpedo, designed to move with an extremely low sound profile. The American crew detected the incoming threat only when it was already just 2 kilometers away. The USS Colorado was forced to cut its towed cable, deploy decoys, and dive hard toward its safe depth limit to avoid the incoming strike. The submarine survived the encounter, but it was pushed out of its protective position, and that changed everything. On the surface, the USS Gerald R. Ford had now lost its final underwater layer of defense. For the first time, the path toward the carrier was almost open. The Russian hunters shifted their focus to the largest target in the formation. From the Yasen M submarine, 2 Zircon hypersonic missiles erupted from the water and climbed into the Arctic sky. Within moments, they accelerated toward Mach 9. This was the Northern Fleet's high-risk move. Russian commanders understood that the missile's plasma layer would generate extreme heat, making it visible to American infrared search and track systems. But they were counting on one factor above all else: speed. At nearly 3 kilometers per second, the Zircon missiles were expected to reach the carrier before the American defense network could complete a reliable intercept calculation. But the U.S. Navy had prepared for exactly this kind of scenario. As the Aegis radar struggled with the plasma interference around the missiles, the IRST system automatically shifted into passive tracking mode. It locked onto 2 blazing heat signatures racing toward the fleet through the frozen air. This time, the American response did not come from cannons or missiles. It came from light. The 60-kilowatt Helios laser turret on the escort destroyer rotated toward the incoming threat and fired an invisible beam directly at the nose section of the missile. The beam was not powerful enough to burn through the missile's heat-resistant body, but it did not need to. Its purpose was to overwhelm the optical guidance sensor during the final approach phase, disrupting the missile's ability to maintain a precise lock on the carrier. In an instant, the Zircon's guidance system lost its focus. Its optical sensor was overwhelmed, and the missile could no longer hold a clean lock on the carrier. That was when the U.S. ships made their move. Several Mark 53 Nolka active decoys launched from the escort vessels at the same time, rising into the air and creating a powerful false signature. To the blinded missiles, the simulated target appeared larger and more attractive than the real ship. Still racing forward at Mach 9, the 2 Zircons followed the false signal, shifted off course, lost stability, and plunged into the Arctic waters nearly 2 kilometers away from the USS Gerald R. Ford. Russia's speed-based gamble had failed against America's layered defense network, but the fight was not over. Beneath the surface, the USS Colorado had survived its emergency dive and was now returning to the engagement zone. The American captain chose a silent drift approach, shutting down propulsion and allowing the submarine to move quietly into the blind area behind the Russian vessel. Using magnetic anomaly detection, the crew confirmed the target. Then came the order to fire. A Mark 48 Mod 7 ADCAP torpedo left the tube and moved into wake-homing mode, tracking the turbulence behind the Russian submarine. Moments later, it detonated near the Yasen M's propulsion section. The impact severely damaged the drive shaft and disabled the rudder. The Russian submarine lost propulsion and could no longer maneuver normally. Its buoyancy control system was also compromised, forcing the vessel into a dangerous, uncontrolled descent. To prevent the crew from being trapped at depth, the Russian captain had only one option. He ordered an emergency blow, forcing the submarine back to the surface. Minutes later, the damaged Yasen M emerged from the dark Arctic water, unable to dive and unable to continue the fight, directly in front of the U.S. fleet. As dawn broke over the ice, the scene became a serious setback for Moscow. One of Russia's most advanced nuclear-powered attack submarines was floating on the surface, disabled and exposed. Both sides had taken major losses, and any further escalation risked pushing the confrontation into a far more dangerous phase. In the sky, the Russian Su-57 squadron was also running out of options. Their ground radar support had been knocked offline, the A-100 early warning aircraft was under heavy electronic pressure, fuel levels were falling, and 12 American F-35Cs had gained position from multiple angles. With no realistic path left, the Russian squadron leader rocked his wings in a signal of surrender and requested permission to leave the airspace under escort. Farther away, the icebreakers carrying the Murmansk BN systems were already retreating in disorder toward Russian territorial waters, trying to avoid a direct response from the U.S. fleet. Operation Arctic Sentinel had succeeded. The United States had protected the Pituffik radar station, broken through the electronic blockade, and collected valuable intelligence on Zircon frequency behavior and Yasen M acoustic signatures. But the bigger question remained unanswered. Would Moscow accept this defeat, or would it prepare an even more dangerous response in the Arctic? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next analysis.